The early morning sun hadn't yet peeked through the clouds when the number 47 bus pulled into the depot. Behind the wheel sat a man who'd been driving these streets for 15 years, a quiet hero in a city of millions. His colleagues called him TJ, and to his regular passengers, he was simply the smiling driver. TJ's day usually started at 4:30 a.m. He'd arrive early, check his bus thoroughly, and greet the maintenance crew with a warmth that made the cold mornings a little brighter. His route wound through some of the city's busiest neighborhoods, from sleepy suburbs to the bustling downtown, and he knew every turn, every stop, and most importantly, every regular passenger by sight. What made TJ special wasn't just his punctuality or his careful driving, it was the way he treated people. He remembered which stop the old veteran with a cane needed help with. He knew when the tired night shift nurse would be heading home and always made sure she had a safe, smooth ride. To TJ, driving wasn't just about moving people from point A to point B, it was about making their journey a little bit better. That fateful Tuesday morning started like any other. The weather forecast had predicted rain, and dark clouds loomed overhead. TJ had just finished his usual safety checks when the first drops began to fall. As he guided the bus through his route, the rain grew heavier, turning the streets into rushing streams and making visibility difficult. He was approaching the Pine Street stop when he spotted something through the rain-streaked windshield. About 50 feet before the official stop, an elderly woman was struggling with her walker. The rain had soaked her clothes, and she was clearly having trouble moving forward on the slick sidewalk. Without thinking twice, TJ did what his heart told him was right. He carefully pulled the bus over, put on his hazard lights, and grabbed his umbrella. "Folks," he announced to his passengers, "I need to help someone for a moment. I appreciate your patience." The bus cameras recorded as he stepped out into the rain, opened his umbrella, and walked to the elderly woman. "Let me help you," he said gently, holding the umbrella over her. "The sidewalk's pretty slippery today." The woman looked up at him with grateful eyes, her hands trembling on her walker. Together, they made their way slowly to the bus, TJ supporting her elbow while shielding her from the rain. He helped her up the steps, made sure she was safely seated, and even secured her walker before returning to his seat. The whole incident took less than 3 minutes. Most passengers smiled or nodded approvingly. They'd seen TJ do similar things before. A few were even recording the touching moment on their phones. What no one knew was that those 3 minutes of kindness were about to change everything. The next morning, TJ was called into the operations office before his shift. The regional supervisor, a man he'd never met before, sat behind a desk with a stern expression. 2 other officials stood nearby, their faces equally serious. The supervisor had a file open in front of him and a video playing on his computer screen, the footage from TJ's bus camera. "According to our records," the supervisor began, not looking up from his papers, "you made an unauthorized stop yesterday at 9:47 a.m. You left your vehicle unattended with passengers aboard. You deviated from the designated route." He listed each point like he was reading a criminal charge sheet. "These are serious violations of company policy." TJ tried to explain about the elderly woman, about the rain, about basic human decency. But the supervisor just held up his hand. "Policy is policy," he said. "We can't have drivers making their own rules. What if something had happened while you were away from your post? What about the insurance liability?" Before TJ could fully process what was happening, he was handed a termination notice. 15 years of perfect service, countless letters of commendation from grateful passengers, all wiped away because he'd helped someone in need. As he walked out of the depot that morning, carrying a small box with his personal belongings, the rain had started again, a gentle drizzle that mixed with the tears he couldn't hold back. But what TJ didn't know was that one of his passengers had captured the entire incident on their phone. As he sat at home that evening, wondering how he'd tell his family about losing his job, the video was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Someone had added a caption, "Bus driver fired for being human. Is this what we've become?" The story touched something in people's hearts. Maybe it was the simple act of kindness in a world that often seemed too busy for such things. Maybe it was the injustice of punishing someone for doing the right thing. Whatever the reason, by nightfall, thousands had shared the video, and local news stations were picking up the story. By midnight, the video had reached well beyond the city limits. People weren't just sharing it, they were telling their own stories. A student remembered how TJ had waited an extra minute when he saw her running for the bus in the rain. A grandfather wrote about how TJ always made sure his wheelchair was properly secured before starting the route. Each story painted a picture of a man who saw his job as more than just driving a bus. The local news station's phone lines were buzzing nonstop. Their social media manager noticed the trending hashtag #BringBackTheDriver and decided to dig deeper. When they learned about TJ's 15 years of service and spotless record, they knew they had to cover the story. The next morning, TJ was sitting at his kitchen table, scrolling through job listings on his phone, when his neighbor knocked on his door. "You're on TV," she exclaimed, pointing to her tablet. There on the screen was the video of him helping the elderly woman, followed by interviews with passengers from his route. "He's not just a bus driver," said one regular passenger, a middle-aged teacher. "He's part of our community. Every morning, he makes sure the kids crossing to school are safe. He knows which passengers need extra help. That's not something you can write in a policy manual." The transit company's social media pages were flooded with comments. People shared stories of their own experiences with TJ, and others expressed outrage at his termination. Some local businesses even offered him jobs, but what touched TJ most was hearing from the elderly woman he'd helped that rainy morning. She'd seen the news and contacted the station. Her name wasn't important, she said, but her story was. She explained how she'd been trying to reach her doctor's appointment that morning. Her usual caregiver had called in sick, and she had no other way to get there. When she saw the rain, she almost gave up, but then TJ appeared like a guardian angel. "That man didn't just help me onto a bus," she told the reporters, her voice trembling with emotion. "He gave me back my dignity." And they fired him for that. The story caught fire online. People began sharing their own experiences of being helped or ignored when they needed assistance. It sparked a larger conversation about humanity in the workplace, about whether following rules should come at the expense of compassion. Local community leaders started speaking up. The city council members received hundreds of emails. Even other bus drivers began wearing small ribbons in support of their colleague, though they were careful not to violate any uniform policies. TJ watched it all unfold with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He'd never wanted attention. He just wanted to help someone in need. His phone kept ringing with calls from reporters, but he politely declined most interviews. "This isn't about me," he told his family. "It's about doing what's right." Then came the moment that would change everything. A small local coffee shop owner started a petition to reinstate TJ. Within hours, it had thousands of signatures. People weren't just signing, they were sharing their own encounters with him. One woman wrote about how he'd waited while her elderly father slowly made his way to the bus stop every morning. Another remembered how he'd helped her when she was struggling with grocery bags and a crying baby. The petition caught the attention of a popular morning show host who decided to feature the story. As TJ watched the segment from his living room, surrounded by his supportive family, he saw something remarkable happening. People from across the country were calling in, sharing similar stories about moments when compassion clashed with corporate policy. But what truly turned the tide was when other transit workers began speaking up. Drivers from different cities shared their own experiences of wanting to help passengers but feeling constrained by rigid rules. The conversation was no longer just about one incident, it had become a movement about human dignity in public service. A retired bus driver with 30 years of experience wrote an opinion piece for the local paper. "Rules are important," he wrote, "but they should guide us, not blind us to human need. What happened to TJ could happen to any of us who choose kindness over convenience." As the story spread, reporters started digging deeper into the transit company's policies. They discovered other instances where strict adherence to rules had led to similar situations. Former employees came forward with their own stories, though none had garnered the public attention that TJ's had. Meanwhile, TJ spent his days helping at his local community center, refusing to let the situation bitter his spirit. "If I had to do it all over again," he told a friend, "I wouldn't change a thing. Some things are just right, whether they're in the rule book or not." What he didn't know was that his story had finally reached someone who could make a real difference, someone who was about to turn this story in an unexpected direction. The CEO of Metropolitan Transit had been off-grid for 2 weeks, enjoying a much-needed vacation in a remote mountain cabin. He'd made it a point to disconnect completely. No emails, no phone calls, no social media. It wasn't until he landed back at the city airport that his phone exploded with notifications. As he scrolled through countless messages and emails, his expression grew increasingly concerned. The company's reputation, built over decades, was crumbling over what should have been a moment of pride, not punishment. His executive assistant had compiled a detailed briefing about the situation, including public reaction, media coverage, and most importantly, the unedited bus camera footage. That evening, in his home office, he watched the video multiple times. He saw how carefully the driver had helped the elderly woman. He noted the patience of the passengers, the professionalism in the driver's manner, the genuine care in his actions. Then he reviewed TJ's personnel file: 15 years of service, dozens of commendations, perfect attendance, not a single passenger complaint. The CEO couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about his own grandmother, who'd relied on public transit in her later years. How many times had she needed help? How many drivers had shown her kindness? He realized this wasn't just about one incident or one driver, it was about the soul of his company. At 5 a.m., he started making calls. First to his legal team, then to human resources, finally to the board members. Some pushed back, worried about setting precedents or undermining authority. But the CEO stood firm. "If we can't support our people when they show compassion," he said, "then what are we really doing here?" By sunrise, he had a plan. But he wanted to handle this personally. No press releases, no corporate statements, just human beings talking to each other. He asked his assistant to track down TJ's phone number, then paused. No, a phone call wouldn't do. This needed to be face-to-face. The CEO's driver picked up TJ from his home the next morning. TJ had been told only that someone from corporate wanted to meet with him. He sat quietly in the back seat, watching the familiar city streets roll by, streets he'd driven thousands of times. The car pulled up not to the Transit Authority's main office, but to a small diner on the corner of Pine Street, right where he'd helped the elderly woman that rainy morning. Inside, the CEO was already waiting at a corner booth. He stood up as TJ entered, extending his hand. No fancy suit, no corporate backdrop, just two people meeting over coffee. The waitress recognized TJ from the news and gave him an encouraging smile as she poured their coffee. "I owe you an apology," the CEO began, surprising TJ with his directness. Not just for what happened, but for creating a system where someone could be punished for showing humanity. He pulled out his tablet and showed TJ something remarkable. A draft of new company guidelines. Right at the top was a section about compassionate service. The CEO explained how TJ's actions had made him reevaluate everything. Yes, schedules were important. Yes, rules mattered. But somewhere along the way, they'd forgotten that they weren't just moving vehicles, they were moving people. "We need more than your job back," the CEO said, sliding a folder across the table. "We need your help to fix this, to make sure no other driver faces punishment for doing the right thing." Inside the folder was not just a reinstatement letter, but a proposal for a new position, Director of Driver Training and Passenger Relations. TJ sat there, coffee growing cold, as the CEO outlined his vision. Every new driver would learn not just routes and regulations, but compassion and judgment. They would hear TJ's story, understand why he made that choice in the rain, and learn when bending a rule serves a greater good. But the CEO wasn't finished. He shared something personal, a story about his own grandmother, about dignity and dependence, about the difference one person's kindness can make. As they talked, the morning crowd thinned, and a lunch crowd began to arrive. Nathan Mann noticed the time passing. The lunch crowd at the diner had come and gone, but the CEO and TJ were still deep in conversation. The waitress had refilled their coffee cups countless times, watching as they drew diagrams on napkins and scribbled notes. What had started as a simple meeting had evolved into something much more significant, a complete reimagining of how the transit system could serve its community. TJ shared stories from his years on the road, not just about helping passengers, but about the daily challenges drivers faced. He talked about the elderly couple who always needed extra time to board, the young mother struggling with a stroller during rush hour, the worker running late for his night shift who just needed a moment of understanding. The CEO listened intently, occasionally stopping TJ to type notes on his tablet. "This is gold," he'd say. "This is what we've been missing." He realized that TJ's experience wasn't just about knowing routes and schedules, it was about understanding people. As the afternoon sun started to cast long shadows through the diner's windows, they finalized their plans. The new position would be more than just a title. TJ would lead a complete overhaul of driver training, focusing on what he called compassionate efficiency, finding ways to help passengers while keeping the system running smoothly. But the CEO had one more surprise. He pulled out his phone and showed TJ a video conference recording from that morning. The board of directors had unanimously approved a new emergency assistance fund. Any passenger experiencing difficulty could receive immediate help without drivers worrying about breaking protocols. They were calling it the Rainy Day Fund. Just then, the diner's door chimed. In walked the elderly woman from that rainy morning, assisted by her daughter. They'd seen TJ's car outside and wanted to thank him properly. The CEO watched as TJ immediately stood up, pulled out a chair, and helped her sit down. The same natural kindness that had started this whole story. The woman's daughter had tears in her eyes as she explained how that simple act of kindness had affected their family. Her mother had made it to her doctor's appointment that day, leading to an early diagnosis that probably saved her life. Sometimes, she said, the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest impact. The CEO absorbed this moment, watching as other diner patrons began to recognize TJ. A spontaneous round of applause broke out. Someone shouted, "Welcome back." The waitress brought over a fresh pot of coffee, refusing to let anyone pay. "This one's on the house," she insisted. That's when the CEO made an impromptu decision. Standing up, he addressed everyone in the diner. He explained who he was and what was happening. Then he asked something unexpected. He wanted their input. What would make their transit system better? What small acts of kindness had made a difference in their lives? For the next hour, people shared their stories. A construction worker talked about the time a driver waited an extra minute when he was running for the last bus of the night. A teacher described how another driver had helped find a student's lost backpack. Each story reinforced what the CEO had already realized. Their transit system wasn't just about moving people, it was about connecting them. As the afternoon turned to evening, TJ and the CEO finalized their plans. The reinstatement would be immediate, but the changes would be gradual. They needed to do this right. The CEO insisted on one more thing. TJ would help write the new guidelines himself. Who better to explain compassionate service than someone who had risked his job to provide it? They shook hands outside the diner, but it felt more like a hug between old friends. The CEO's driver was waiting to take TJ home, but TJ politely declined. "I think I'll take the bus," he said with a smile. "I need to say hello to some old friends." News of TJ's return spread through the transit system like wildfire. The morning he walked back into the depot, the maintenance crew stopped what they were doing and broke into spontaneous applause. One of the older mechanics wiped away tears, remembering how TJ had driven him home after his car broke down during a snowstorm last winter. But this wasn't just a return, it was a new beginning. The CEO had given TJ an office, but he rarely used it. Instead, he could be found in the driver's break room, in the maintenance bay, or riding different routes across the city. He was building something new, one conversation at a time. The first change came in the form of compassion cards, simple cards given to every driver that authorized them to make reasonable stops or delays to help passengers in need. No more fear of breaking rules for doing the right thing. The cards became a symbol of trust between management and drivers. TJ's training sessions quickly became legendary. He didn't lecture from a manual, he shared real stories, real experiences. "Every passenger has a story," he'd tell the new drivers. "Your route isn't just a line on a map, it's part of people's lives." He brought in regular passengers to share their perspectives, helping drivers understand the impact of their daily decisions. The elderly woman from the Rainy Day became a regular guest speaker. She'd tell new drivers how a simple act of kindness had given her the courage to keep living independently. I was ready to give up that day, she'd say. But one person's kindness reminded me that I wasn't alone. The changes went deeper than just policy. TJ worked with the maintenance team to improve bus accessibility features. He collaborated with schedule planners to build in small time buffers during peak hours when more passengers might need assistance. Every change was based on real experiences, real needs. Word spread to other transit authorities. Representatives from neighboring cities came to observe the new training program. They watched as TJ took new drivers on empathy routes, experiencing the system from a passenger's perspective, sometimes using wheelchairs or walking with canes to understand mobility challenges firsthand. The Rainy Day Fund became a model for other cities. When a young mother's car broke down miles from her child's daycare, a driver used the fund to make sure she got there safely. When an elderly man missed his stop and became confused, a driver took the time to help him contact his family. Each story validated the CEO's vision of compassionate service. But the most remarkable changes were the smallest ones. Drivers began sharing stories in their break room about the moments that helped someone. The maintenance crew started keeping a log of accessibility issues they noticed, even if no one had complained. The entire culture was shifting. TJ's original bus route became known as the Kindness Line. Passengers would sometimes wait for his specific bus, not because it was faster, but because they knew they'd be treated with dignity. Other drivers didn't mind. They were creating their own reputations for care and compassion on their routes. One rainy morning, almost exactly a year after the incident that started it all, TJ was training a group of new drivers when he spotted something through the depot window. The CEO was helping an elderly passenger with groceries off a bus, holding an umbrella over her head. The CEO caught his eye and smiled, no words needed. The local news did a follow-up story titled "When Kindness Becomes Policy." They interviewed passengers, drivers, and city officials about the changes. But the most powerful moment came when they asked TJ if he'd do it all again, stop in the rain to help someone in need, even knowing he might lose his job. The city's transit system had become something of a legend in the public transportation world. Transit authorities from across the country sent representatives to learn about what they called the kindness revolution. But for the people who lived it every day, it wasn't about revolution, it was about remembering what matters most. The impact reached far beyond the bus system. Local businesses started their own kindness initiatives. The corner grocery store created a special counter for elderly customers who needed extra time. The coffee shop near the main station started a suspended coffee program where people could pay forward drinks for those who couldn't afford them. One cold morning, TJ was riding along on a training run when he noticed something remarkable. A new driver, barely 2 weeks on the job, pulled over to help a man who had dropped his work documents in a gust of wind. The driver didn't hesitate or check a manual, he just acted. When TJ asked him about it later, the driver shrugged and said, "It's just what we do here." The CEO kept his promise about the Rainy Day Fund, but something unexpected happened. Local businesses started contributing to it voluntarily. The fund grew from covering emergency situations to supporting regular programs, like free rides for job interviews and medical appointments for those who couldn't afford them. The elderly woman who TJ had helped that rainy day became the chairperson of a new passenger advisory board. She brought together regular riders to share their experiences and suggestions. Her first proposal? Installing better lighting at bus stops so drivers could more easily spot passengers needing assistance at night. TJ's training program evolved too. He started bringing in successful business leaders to talk about customer service, healthcare workers to teach basic assistance techniques, and even psychologists to help drivers understand and manage the emotional aspects of their work. But the most powerful sessions were still the simple story circles, where drivers shared their daily experiences of helping others. One day, a young passenger wrote a letter to the local paper. She described how she'd been having the worst day of her life, lost her job, missed an interview, and was about to miss her daughter's school play. The bus driver not only made sure she got there on time, but gave her a card with job resources and words of encouragement. "That driver didn't just get me to my destination," she wrote. "They gave me hope." The city council took notice. They commissioned a study on the impact of the new transit policies. The results were stunning. Customer satisfaction had skyrocketed. driver retention was at an all-time high. Even more surprisingly, the system was running more efficiently. Turns out, when people feel cared for, they're more likely to help keep things running smoothly. Other departments started adopting similar approaches. The Parks Department created a courtesy corps of workers trained to assist visitors. The Public Library developed a program to help elderly patrons with technology. Each initiative traced its roots back to that rainy morning when one driver chose kindness over rules. TJ kept a photo on his desk, not of himself, but of that first bus he drove after coming back. It was covered in welcome back messages from passengers, each note telling a different story of how he made their lives a little better. "That's our real job," he'd tell new drivers, pointing to the photo. "We're not just moving people through the city, we're moving the city forward through people." The CEO made a tradition of riding different routes each month, not as a supervisor but as a regular passenger. He'd watch the small acts of kindness that had become routine. Drivers helping parents with strollers, assisting elderly passengers with their groceries, waiting an extra moment for someone running to catch the bus. 5 years had passed since that rainy morning. The city's transit system had become a model of compassionate service, but today was special. Hundreds of people gathered in the Central Depot for the unveiling of something unprecedented, a wall of kindness. The wall displayed thousands of small tiles, each one carrying a story. A mother wrote about the driver who waited while she helped her child with special needs board the bus. A college student described how a driver's encouragement helped him keep going to classes despite working 2 jobs. An elderly man shared how the daily interactions with caring drivers kept him connected to the world after his wife passed away. TJ stood at the back of the crowd, watching as people touched the tiles, finding their own stories among the collection. The CEO had insisted on making this wall not as a monument to policy changes, but as a testimony to the power of human connection. Each tile represented a moment when someone chose kindness over convenience, compassion over rules. The training program had evolved into something remarkable. New drivers didn't just learn routes and regulations, they learned to see the human story behind every stop, every passenger, every moment of their day. The depot's break room had become a place where drivers shared not just coffee, but stories of lives touched and moments that mattered. That morning, as the crowd gathered, something beautiful happened. The elderly woman from that rainy day arrived, now using a wheelchair. She wasn't alone. Dozens of regular passengers had come to share their stories. They weren't just riders anymore. They were part of a community that had grown from one simple act of kindness. The CEO stepped up to speak, but instead of a formal speech, he shared a story. He talked about his own mother, who now rode the bus regularly. "She tells me she feels safer, more cared for on our buses than anywhere else in the city," he said. "That's not because of our policies, it's because of our people." The Rainy Day Fund had grown into a foundation, supporting not just emergency assistance, but community programs across the city. Other transit systems had adopted similar programs, creating a ripple effect of kindness that spread far beyond city limits. TJ's original route had become known as the Heart Line, though he now spent most of his time teaching and mentoring other drivers. But once a month, he still drove that route, reconnecting with the passengers and places that had changed his life and the life of the city. As the ceremony ended, someone noticed it had started to rain. Without a word, dozens of umbrellas appeared, shared among strangers. A young driver helped an elderly man to his car. Another stayed late to make sure everyone got home safely. These weren't special acts anymore, they were just the way things were done. The last tile on the wall was special. It showed a simple scene: a bus stopped in the rain, a driver helping someone board. Below it, a simple message read, "Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can start the biggest change." That evening, as TJ walked through the depot one last time, he saw a new driver helping a passenger plan her route. The driver wasn't checking any manual or worrying about schedules, he was simply being human. And in that moment, TJ knew that the real change wasn't in the policies or programs, it was in the hearts of people who had learned that kindness was always the right choice. The story of the driver who got fired for helping someone had become more than just a viral moment or a policy change. It had become a reminder that in a world of rules and regulations, humanity and compassion still matter most. And sometimes it takes just one person to remind us of that truth.